That's what we got to work on.
Just a couple of minutes left in this conversation. You can see the rest of it in the C-SPAN video library. Go to cspan.org. The Senate returns today to continue debate on the immigration bill. The measure would boost border security and workplace enforcement, allow tens of thousands of new high and low-skilled workers into the country, and create a 13-year path to citizenship for the 11 million immigrants in the country illegally. And now live to the Senate floor here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Strong deliverer, you are our strength and shield. Use your powerful arms to help those in need and to prepare us to be instruments of your purposes. Lord, listen to our longings and hear our cries as we intercede for this land we love. Bring to America the righteousness that exalts nations as you lead us away from the sins that bring reproach to any people. Use our lawmakers in this endeavor so that they will plant seeds that will produce a moral and ethical harvest. May their lives provide exemplary models of moral excellence so that people can see their ethical congruence. Teach them to hate pride and deceit as they strive to treat others as they want others to treat them. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., June 12, 2013. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable William M. Cowan, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Your remarks. The Senate will be in period of morning business for an hour. Majority will control the first half, Republicans the final half. Following that morning business, Senate will resume consideration S-744, which is the immigration bill. So we'll work through amendments today on the bill. Senators will be notified when votes are scheduled. Mr. President, last night, the United States Senate advanced a bipartisan immigration reform bill that will be good for national security and really good for the economy. It will be good for American citizens as well as those who aspire to one day become citizens. It's truly gratifying to see the momentum behind this common sense reform proposal. 84 senators voted to adopt the motion to proceed to this legislation, a very, very strong vote. By comparison, the Senate failed to advance the immigration reform bill just 6 years ago when only 46 senators voted in debate on that measure and allow us to proceed. It is a sign of progress that the legislation now before the Senate has not been stopped procedurally. I hope, Mr. President, that we're allowed to proceed in this legislation without being blocked by some arcane Senate rule, that we can finish this legislation and send it to the House of Representatives. I applaud the Gang of Eight. It's a bipartisan proposal, and that's how the Senate used to work. They have worked hard. They've worked through hundreds of different proposals. In the committee alone, after the Gang of Eight finished, it went before the Judiciary Committee. There was over 100 amendments, many more than 100 amendments. They adopted 46, and some 40 amendments were Republican amendments that were adopted. So Chairman Leahy conducted a fair markup. No one disputes that. So I commend the Gang of Eight for allowing the bill to get to the Judiciary Committee and the Judiciary Committee for giving us now this proposal on the floor, and now Democrats allowing us to proceed on this legislation as well as Republicans. Our goal now is to pass the strongest legislation possible with as many votes as possible while staying true to our principles. Then await what the House is going to do. The Speaker has said he wants a bill that will allow the Democrats to vote. Mr. President, that is really good news, because in the House for the last two Congresses, there are very few opportunities for the Democrats to vote on substantive legislation. The Speaker has said that he will only allow legislation to pass over there that has a majority of the majority. That means only Republicans. If they don't have enough Republican votes, they're not going to bring a bill up for a vote. So I'm very pleased that the Speaker would say that. It's important that we understand the procedure we've used for 230-plus years in this body. We pass something here, get past something in the House, we go to conference and work out our differences. So I understand, Mr. President, that we have a long road before us, and more work will be necessary to get this bill across the finish line. I truly understand that. And I know some of my Republican colleagues will support this bill if they feel confident what's in the bill adequately addresses the need to secure our borders. And I agree that the legislation focused on border security a lot. I think that's important. I'm glad it did. Reform that takes significant steps to stop illegal crossings is important, and reform that does not take significant steps to stop illegal crossings will fail. That's why I so admire what was done by the Gang of Eight and the Judiciary Committee in regard to this, Mr. President. They've done really a terrific job on border security. And we should also acknowledge the progress President Obama's administration has already made to secure our borders. Illegal border crossings are down 80%. That's no small accomplishment. And yesterday I received a letter from my colleagues, the Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Pat Leahy, and the Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, Tom Carper, detailing the tremendous strides we've made toward a more secure border. As described by the Wall Street Journal, illegal entries nationwide are at a 4-decade low. We have less crossings now than we had at any time during the last 40 years. And the number of illegal entrants who sneak into the country through the southern border and successfully elude law enforcement, so-called getaways, that's what they're called, is down 86%. Smarter technology, physical barriers, and double the number of agents at the border have made this achievement possible. We must ensure those who come to America seeking a better life do so in compliance with our laws. The measure before the Senate builds on the progress we've made by allocating even more resources for border security infrastructure, and that includes patrol bases, unmanned vehicles, yes, Mr. President, drones, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, sensors, X-rays, cameras, and more. And it also includes, this legislation, additional funding for prosecution of those who are caught crossing illegally. The legislation also establishes 2 strict but attainable statutory border security goals: to prevent 90% of illegal entries and to monitor the entire southern border not just high-risk sectors of the border, the whole border. Chairman Leahy and Chairman Carper agreed. In their letter, they said, this legislation will reduce illegal entries by reforming our legal immigration system. This legislation will make it virtually impossible for undocumented people to work, so they'll no longer have an incentive to enter illegally. This is what my two colleagues said in their letter. Quote, we need to stop focusing our attention on the symptoms and start dealing with the underlying root causes of illegal immigration in a way that's tough, practical, and fair. That says it all, Mr. President. This bill does that. But there's one thing this bill does not do and should not do. It does not and should not make the path to citizenship contingent on attaining border security goals that are impossible to measure. That would leave millions who aspire to become citizens in indefinite limbo. We've got to move past this. 6 years ago, we tried to do something about it, and the situation only gotten worse. This legislation is critical. Mr. President, if we made those goals impossible, the legislation would be a failure. This would give opponents of citizenship both an incentive and an opportunity to prevent our border security goals from being met in order to block the path to citizenship. I'm concerned that some who oppose the very idea of reform see these triggers as a backdoor way to undermine that legislation, and we must be very careful in recognizing people are trying to do that with this legislation now before this body. I believe some Republicans with no intention of voting for the final bill, no intention, regardless of how it's amended, seek to offer amendments with the sole purpose of derailing this vital reform. I commend Senators, Democrats and Republicans who sincerely want to make this proposal stronger by enhancing its border security provisions. So I look forward to hearing the ideas the next few days on amendments and ideas to make our country safer and more secure. If that's the intent of this legislation, we'll certainly look at it, and I hope we can move forward as expeditiously as possible. I'm glad colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, are engaged in this debate and interested in offering amendments. But I hope those amendments will be constructive in nature. We have come too far, and the country needs this legislation too badly to lose sight of our purpose now. As Martin Luther said, quote, everything that is done in the world is done by hope. And there's no better example of that, Mr. President, than this legislation. Because hope is what it's all about. As Martin Luther said, everything that is done in the world is done by hope. And I certainly believe that with this legislation.
Mr. President,
The Republican leader.
I'd like to send my sympathies to the many families in Kentucky affected by a terrible bus accident that occurred yesterday afternoon. A group of Wagner High School students was returning to Louisville after a visit to Eastern Kentucky University when their bus crashed on Interstate 64. Of the 42 people on board, 34 were taken to area hospitals. Thankfully, news sources report no loss of life. I'm going to continue to closely follow the details of this accident. The people of Kentucky, always generous of spirit, have already responded to this accident with an outpouring of support for the crash victims. I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful also that this situation was not much worse. Now, on an entirely different matter, Mr. President, Senate Democrats are not content with the additional powers they have, powers greater than those enjoyed by any previous majority. So they intend to manufacture a crisis over nominations as a pretext for a further power grab. Yet the Senate is treating President Obama's nominees very fairly. For example, let's just look at how the Senate has treated his judicial nominees. Overall, the Senate has confirmed 193 lower court judges and defeated only 2. Defeated only 2. That's a 990 batting average. a .990 batting average. After this week, the Senate will have approved 24 of the President's lifetime appointments compared to just nine for President Bush at a comparable point in his second term. And I would mention that my party actually controlled the Senate then, so we could have arguably, confirmed a lot more. President Bush got 9 at this point. In his second term, President Obama 24. In last Congress, Obama had more district court confirmations than in any of the previous 8 Congresses. He also had almost 50% more confirmations, 171, than President Bush, 119, under similar circumstances. To support an unprecedented power grab, the administration and its allies in the Senate have resorted to truly outlandish claims about how the president's judicial nominees are being treated, sort of making this stuff up. Washington Post fact checker gave the president 2 Pinocchios for extreme claims about Republican delays of his judicial nominees, noting that in some ways, the president's nominees are actually being moved along better than Bush's. The Washington Post cited CRS's conclusion that from nomination to confirmation, one of the most relevant indicators, according to Brookings scholar, Obama's circuit court nominees are being processed about 100 days quicker than President Bush's. 350.6 days for Bush to 256.9 for Obama. Factcheck.org, during Obama's first term, his nominees to federal courts actually were confirmed more quickly, on average, than Bush's first-term nominees, measured from the day of nomination to the day of the confirmation vote. PolitiFact, the average wait for George W. Bush's circuit court nominees was actually longer from nomination to confirmation. So as you can see, Mr. President, this is a manufactured crisis, one that does not in fact exist. In order to try to justify a power grab to fundamentally change the Senate. Now, at the beginning of each of the last 2 Congresses, we've had this discussion at length. At the beginning of the previous Congress, here's what the Majority Leader said back in January of 2011. He said, I agree that the proper way to change the Senate rules is through the procedures established in those rules, and I will oppose, he said, this is January of 2011, any effort in this Congress or the next to change the Senate's rules other than through the regular order. I will oppose any effort in this Congress or the next, the one we're in now, to change the rules of the Senate in any other way than through the regular order. And the regular order, Mr. President, is it takes 67 votes, not even 60, but 67 votes to change the rules of the Senate. Not being willing to keep the commitment he made in January of 2011, we went around and around again at the beginning of 2013, this year. And the Senate this year, after considerable discussions, joined by a number of members of the Senate on both sides of the aisle, passed 2 new rules and 2 new standing orders, and in the wake of that action, an additional commitment was made, and here was the exchange on the floor January 24th of this year. I said I would confirm with the Majority Leader that the Senate would not consider other resolutions relating to any standing order or rules this Congress unless they went through the regular order process. We had just done that. We'd followed the regular order and we'd passed 2 rules changes and 2 standing orders. The Majority Leader said that is correct. Any other resolutions related to Senate procedure would be subject to a regular order process, including consideration by the Rules Committee. Now, Mr. President, that wasn't a promise made based on Majority Leader's view of good behavior. But, of course, by any objective standard, there hadn't been any bad behavior anyway, even if that would justify breaking a commitment that was not contingent. Now, my friend, the majority leader's taken to kind of leaving the floor in the hopes that somehow this would go away if only he were not here. What won't go away is the unequivocal commitment made at the beginning of this Congress, so we would know what the rules were for the duration of this Congress. And colleagues, I think, on both sides of the aisle have a right to know whether the commitment made by the leader of this body, the leader of the majority in this body, is going to be kept. That's the only way we can function. Our word is the currency of the realm in the Senate. And as you can see from the facts, this is a manufactured crisis. There is no crisis over the way the Senate is functioning. And in fact, except for these periodic threats by the majority leader to break the rules of the Senate in order to change the rules of the Senate, we've been operating much better this Congress than in previous Congresses. Bills have been open for amendment. We've been able to get them to passage. They've been bipartisan in large measure. The Senate these days is not broken and doesn't need to be fixed, particularly if your judgment of fixing the Senate is to not keep a commitment you made at the beginning of the year. So, Mr. President, I would just conclude by saying I'm going to bring this up every morning, and the majority leader not being here or not responding doesn't make it go away. What my colleagues in the minority have on their minds is whether the commitment will be kept. And at some point, the majority leader is going to have to answer that question, because it's not going away. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, this past weekend, President Obama met with President Xi of China in California for a summit meeting between the two leaders. It was an opportunity for a personal relationship between the leader of China and the leader of the United States in order to improve the trust between the two countries. China is important to the United States. China, as we know, is a member of the Permanent Council of the Security Council of the United Nations, a key player in developing international policies that are important to the United States and global security. China is very influential in the policies concerning North Korea and Iran. China is a key trading partner of the United States. We know the amount of products that go back and forth between China and the United States. President Obama has correctly identified Asia as a region of particular interest, his rebalanced Asia policy, because the importance of Asia to the United States. We are a Pacific power, and Asia is critically important for regional security as well as for global security. I had the opportunity of chairing the subcommittee on East Asia and Pacific of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And in that capacity, 2 weeks ago, I visited China, the Republic of Korea, and Japan. In China, I was able to observe firsthand the progress that is being made in that country and to meet with key leaders of the Chinese government. And I did see much progress. I saw economic change in China as to how they're becoming a more open society from the point of view of entrepreneurship. I saw rights that have been advanced. People do have more freedom than they had several decades ago. And I saw an opportunity where the United States and China could build a stronger relationship between our two countries. It starts with building trust. There's a lot of mistrust out there. So that's why I was particularly pleased about the summit meeting this past weekend. We have common interests. China is critically important to the United States on making sure the Korea Peninsula remains a non-nuclear peninsula. China has tremendous impact over North Korea. and does not want to see North Korea continue its ambition to become a nuclear weapon power. They can help us in resolving that issue, hopefully in a way that will help us in a peaceful manner. I can't help but observe when I was in Beijing that China has a huge environmental challenge. The entire time I was there, I never saw the sun, and that was not because of clouds. It was because of pollution, which is common in Beijing. It is not only a problem that China needs to deal with, it's a political necessity. The people of China know that their air is dirty. Here's an opportunity for the United States, working with China, the two large emitters of greenhouse gases, to come together and show international leadership by what we can do in our own countries to encourage progress, but also international progress on this issue. While I was in China, I had a chance to advance areas of concern. And I want to talk about that. Our security interests with China go towards their military, yes, but it also goes towards their economic conditions and their respect for human rights. I raised throughout my visit to China my concern, and I think America's concern, the international concern, about China recognizing universally accepted human rights. The right to dissent is not there in China. June 4th, we celebrated another anniversary at Tiananmen Square, where the student protests turned very deadly. It is still dangerous to dissent in China. Civil rights lawyers can lose their right to practice law and can be physically intimidated if they are too aggressive in representing those who disagree with government policies. China has a policy to this day of detaining people, putting them in prison for their, quote, re-education. That could be for up to 4 years without trial and without being questioned as to why they're being detained, solely because they disagree with the government's policy. If you're born in a community, you're registered in that community. There may not be economic opportunity there for you. You might want to move to a big city in order to explore additional economic opportunities for you and your family. In China, that's not possible for the great majority of the people. They're registered in their community. They're expected to live in their community. They're expected to work in that community. So you have the haves and the have-nots. There are many people in China that are doing very well. The vast majority are not. And then there's the issue of religious freedom. I think we all know about Tibet and the Buddhists in Tibet and how they've been harassed. We know about the Uyghurs and the Muslim community. What really shocked me was talking to the Protestants who have their house churches. They explained to me that if their churches get too big, maybe over 25 or 30 members, they lose their right to meet. The government's worried about too many people getting together to celebrate their religion. Well, that's certainly unacceptable. It violates international recognized human rights standards. And then they block access, full access to the Internet. Sites such as the New York Times or Bloomberg are considered to be too difficult for the Chinese people to accept, and the government blocks those sources. Perhaps one of the most difficult challenges that China has today is that it doesn't trust its own people to innovate and create. Instead, they use the cyber to try to steal our rights, our innovation, not just in America, but throughout the world. We are very concerned about the proper use of protecting intellectual property, and I raised that during my visit to China. We're also concerned about the cybersecurity issues, and I know that was on the agenda of President Obama and President Xi. And we would urge progress to be made on acceptable standards on the use of cyber. And then there's the issue of corruption. Because so much is determined by where you live in your local government, corruption is widespread, and that needs to be changed. So these are important subjects that we raise in a country that's critically important to the United States, but these issues must be debated. When President Park was here, the President of the Republic of Korea, she mentioned in the floor to a joint session of Congress that she wants a security dialogue in Northeast Asia. When I met with her when I was in Seoul, we had a chance to talk more about it. And the more that she talked about the security dialogue, the more it reminded me of the Helsinki Commission. the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was established in 1975 as a security dialogue between all the countries of Europe, now Central Asia, United States, and Canada. That security dialogue deals with all three baskets of concern. Yes, we're carrying actions, and we have serious military issues that we need to take up in the Northeast. Maritime security issues are very much of concern to all the countries of Northeast Asia. But you also need to deal with economic freedom and opportunity, and you need to deal with human rights. This type of a dialogue would allow us in the North to participate with the major countries in the Northeast Asia to work out and know the concerns of each of the countries. It would include not just China and the Republic of Korea, but Japan, North Korea, the United States, and Russia. I would urge the region to either adopt a security dialogue similar to the Helsinki process, or to look at becoming a part of the Helsinki process. We do have regional forums, and there is a regional forum for Asia. So it's a possibility that they actually could work under the Helsinki framework. In my visits to both Japan and the Republic of Korea, I know that we have two very close allies. Japan, of course, a treaty ally. We have U.S. troops in both Korea and Japan, and we're working out ways to make our troop presence more effective, consistent with the political realities of both of those countries. Both Japan and the Republic of Korea strongly support our policies in Iran and Afghanistan, on the Korea Peninsula. Their relationship between these two countries must improve. They're serious issues, and of course the comfort women issue during World War II is a matter of major concern to the Korean population. I certainly support and understand that, but it's important for those two allies of the United States to become closer allies and to move forward in areas of mutual interest, and I urge them to do that. In Japan, I had meetings on the economic issues, on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which clearly are areas that we can make advancements. I saw an opportunity to advance U.S. interests in the rebalance to Asia. It's not a pivot to Asia. We used that term originally. It's not. We've been active in Asia for centuries. It's a rebalance because we recognize the importance of Asia. And I think we can do that by enhancing our relationships with all the countries in Asia. It's an opportunity to advance U.S. security interests through military cooperation, and I did talk about military to military in China. I also talked, particularly in Japan, about more of their students coming here to the United States to advance good governance and economic relationships, and to have a responsible environmental programs. The subcommittee that I chair has already held 2 hearings on the rebalance to Asia, including good governance and military issues. We're going to hold future hearings dealing with the environmental issues and economic issues. Clearly, working with the President, I see a major opportunity to advance U.S. interests through our rebalance to Asia policies. With that, Mr. President, I'm going to ask consent to proceed and have these comments appear in a different section in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we all lost a dear friend when Frank Lautenberg passed away just a little over a week ago. He was a friend, he was a colleague, he was a mentor. In the last Congress, I had the opportunity to sit next to him on the floor of the United States Senate. Our desks were back there in the last row, and I had the chance to sit next to him. And I tell you, you've heard this many times, but when we had those vote-a-ramas, Frank kept me very much engaged. His sense of humor, his ability to use contemporary activities with his sense of humor kept us all going, and we're certainly going to miss that humor. I also sat next to him on the Environment and Public Works Committee, and he was a fierce defender of public health and the environment, and I'm going to certainly miss his advocacy. He was there to protect clean air. He chaired that subcommittee and took on every special interest in order to protect our children and to protect our communities. He was a fierce defender of the environment, recognizing that we all have a responsibility to pass on the environment in a better condition to future generations. His story is really a story about the success of America. Here we have a child of immigrant family who came to this country and started anew with virtually no resources. And it's very appropriate that I'm talking about Frank Lautenberg on the day in which the Immigration Reform Bill is on the floor of the United States Senate. I know that if Frank were here, he would be talking about his own family and his own experiences and why the passage of this immigration bill is so important for America's future. Yes, we're going to do the right thing for the values of America, but we're also going to help America's economic future and our security in the future. So he grew up in a family of poverty. His father died when he was very young. He really had no choice after high school but to enter the military. But he wanted to enter the military because he wanted to serve his country. So he went and served our country in World War II, and as you know, he was the last surviving member of the United States Senate who served in World War II. He did an incredible service to our country under extremely difficult circumstances. He came back to the United States, and this country offered him the GI Bill opportunity for education. But for that GI Bill, Frank Lautenberg never would have had those educational opportunities. He took advantage of it and went to business school and used that for develop a business that was innovative and creative. There was a need out there to deal with personnel costs by businesses. And Frank Lautenberg developed with his partners a way in which that service could be provided in the most cost-effective way. Now, what did that do? That made this country more efficient, more effective. What that did was create a lot of jobs for this country, and it also made Frank Lautenberg a fairly wealthy person. That's the American way. Innovation to grow our economy, to create jobs, and to benefit by your own innovation. Frank Lautenberg took advantage of that and succeeded in a great way. But he wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted to give back to his community. So he served his community. He served his community in many ways. There's a whole list of community organizations that he provided leadership, his own personal time, in order to help people. He did that. Jewish Federation became a national leader to help communities all over the world. Frank Lautenberg did that as a private citizen because he thought it was the right thing to do. But then he decided he wanted to serve his community in a different way. So he ran for the United States Senate, got elected to the United States Senate, served 2 different terms in the United States Senate. He's the only senator that was both the junior and senior senator twice from the same state, but he never forgot his roots. He never forgot where he came from, and he has a long list of accomplishments, from helping refugees come here to America to helping keep air we breathe on airlines safe for our children. And the list is voluminous. We've already talked about it. He will be missed by all. Our thoughts and prayers are with Bonnie, who we all know so well, and his entire family, the people of New Jersey and the people of this nation. Frank Lautenberg was an extraordinary person who made a lasting mark. He will be missed by all, and we all know that we're better because of having served with him. With that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
And I would first ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to address two issues this morning, but starting with the issue that's confronting us here on the Senate floor, and it's a great challenge, but it's also a great opportunity. That's immigration. And the opportunity that we have to come together in the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, to fix a broken system and to help our economy. And I think along the way, as we're working through the immigration bill over the next days and weeks, I think we can not only get this issue on the right track substantively, but we can also send a very strong message to the American people that on major consequential issues for the American people that we can come together, work together, and get a good result for them. And I think that that in and of itself is worthy of a lot of attention. But even as we're working on immigration, of course, we have to concern ourselves with a whole range of other issues. One that I'll speak to just briefly this morning is the issue of our policy as it relates to Syria. We were confronted this morning with a headline in the Washington Post. I'll hold it up, but it reads, Iran on ascent as Syria churns, the front page of the Post, and I'll just read the first graph of this story. Quote, as fighters with Lebanon's Hezbollah movement wage the battles that are helping Syria's regime survive, their chief sponsor, Iran, is emerging as the biggest victor in the wider regional struggle for influence that the Syrian conflict has become, unquote. This is one of the reasons why I and others have, for not just weeks, but months now, have been urging the administration and the Congress to come together on a more focused and more effective strategy as it relates to Syria. We had a good bipartisan effort in the Foreign Relations Committee. We were able to pass out of the committee legislation that dealt with Syria that would provide a whole range of supports and efforts that will lead to a better result in Syria. I know the White House has spent the last couple of weeks and will be spending even more time today to come up with a policy that makes sense. But I don't think we can any longer pretend that this issue is not an issue that concerns our national security, because every day the Iranian regime and Hezbollah plot against us. And anything that results in the regime in Iran being strengthened, as the Washington Post points to today in this story, is bad for our national security. So we have a lot of work to do, and again, this should be bipartisan, but the administration needs to focus on Syria and come to a conclusion about the way forward that will be in the best interest of our national security and also in the best interest of the people of Syria, who are fighting valiantly against the Assad regime, which we all agree should not be in power. But we can't just wish that. We have to take the steps that will lead to that result in a concerted fashion with allies in the region. I'd ask consent that this story entitled Iran on Ascent as Syria Churns from the Washington Post this morning be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move to the second part of my remarks, which is to talk about two of our judicial nominees who will be coming before the Senate today. Both of these nominees will be voted on today to be members of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. And I just wanted to give senators the benefit of a little bit of biographical background on both of them. First, I'll start with Nitza I. Quinones Alejandro. Judge Quinones is recognized by her colleagues as being very well prepared as a judge and conscientious as a judicial official who exhibits an outstanding judicial temperament and fairness. Since 1991, Nitza Quinones Alejandro has served as a trial judge for the First Judicial District of the Pennsylvania Court of Common Pleas in Philadelphia, working on criminal and civil trials and all of the diversity and difficulty and challenge that comes with that. She runs a good courtroom. She treats lawyers and litigants fairly and renders thoughtful decisions. She was first nominated for judicial appointment back in May of 1990 by Governor Robert P. Casey, my father, when he was serving in office in Pennsylvania. And at the time, Judge, not quite then a judge, but Judge Quinones became the first Latina state court judge in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, way back in the early 1990s. Prior to her judicial appointment, Judge Quinones served as an arbitrator for the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas from 1980 to 1991. She also worked as a staff attorney with the Department of Veterans Affairs and an attorney advisor for the Office of Hearings and Appeals at the Department of Health and Human Services. She was also a staff attorney with Community Legal Services in Philadelphia. Judge Quinones is a founding member and has been active within the Hispanic Bar Association of Pennsylvania for the past 20 years. She has actively recruited students from local law schools and hired numerous Hispanic attorneys as full-time law clerks and serves as a mentor to countless students and professionals. She's a native of Puerto Rico, and she graduated from the University of Puerto Rico School of Business Administration, cum laude, in 1972 and acquired her Juris Doctor degree from the University of Puerto Rico School of Law in 1975. Her commitment to public service and her substantial judicial experience will make her an outstanding federal judge. It's also, I should note, a remarkable American story that Judge Quinones brings to us today, and we look forward to her vote today and her confirmation. We appreciate the work that's been done to bring her nomination to the floor, and I've enjoyed working with Senator Toomey on both Judge Quinones' nomination as well as the second nomination that I'll review now. It's Jeffrey L. Schmel, and Judge Schmel will bring an extraordinary record of knowledge, experience, and public service to the federal bench. He's well regarded by lawyers and litigants who appear before him, as well as the people of Reading in Berks County, Pennsylvania. Since 2007, he has served as the president judge for the Berks County Court of Common Pleas, where he has served as a judge since 1998. Prior to joining the bench, Judge Schmel was a partner at Rhoda, Stout & Bradley from 1988 to 97, where he also worked as an associate since 1986. He served as the county solicitor for Berks County from 1989 to 97. He owned his own law firm from 81 to 86. He also served as an assistant district attorney in Berks County as a prosecutor and as an assistant public defender for the Berks County Public Defender's Office, a rare combination, both as a public defender and as a prosecutor. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Dickinson College in 1977 and Juris Doctorate doctor degree from the University of Toledo Law School in 1980. So we look forward to Judge Schmel's confirmation as well. And I think with both of these individuals, there are two individuals about whom we can be very proud and vote for and support with enthusiasm. And it always helps when you have two judges who are the result of the working together of a Democratic senator and a Republican senator, in this case Senator Toomey and I working together to bring their nomination to this point and to get them confirmed on the floor of the Senate. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about the advice and consent duties of the United States Senate. As you know, our Constitution gives the Senate the responsibility to advise the President on high-level executive positions and judgeships. The Senate is also asked to consent on those appointments to ensure that only those who are worthy of the public's trust hold positions of such great power. The confirmation process is a way to protect the American people from nominees who simply aren't up to the job or to the times that we're in as a country. It's also an important opportunity for the Senate to exercise oversight over the agencies and the policies of an administration, and to do this on behalf of the American people. Let me repeat that. It's about exercising oversight on behalf of the American people. That's one of the most important roles that we play as senators. That's one of the reasons that our nation's founding fathers intentionally made the pace of the Senate deliberate. They wanted to make sure that there was free debate on important subjects so that we could give appropriate consideration to policies, to laws, and to nominations. The father of our Constitution, James Madison, explained the Senate's role was, quote, first to protect the people against their rulers. First to protect the people against their rulers. That was the point of this body. That's why over its long history the Senate has adopted rules that provide strong protections for political minorities. Well, lately some in the majority have decided that the American people shouldn't ask so many questions and that the minority shouldn't have so many rights. Here's a little perspective on the conversation that we're having today. Over the last 6 years, Majority Leader Reid has taken an unprecedented stand against the rights of the minority in this body. He's done it through procedural tactics like filling the amendment tree on bills and bypassing committees using something called Rule 14 of the Senate rules. Those techniques may make it easier for the Majority Leader to get what he wants, but they shut many senators out of legislating, and they shut out the Americans that we represent, Democrats as well as Republicans. At the beginning of the last Congress, and again at the start of this Congress, there was an attempt to use the so-called nuclear option, and to use it to radically change the rules of the Senate and to strip the rights of the minority. Back in 2011, Majority Leader Reid made a commitment not to use the nuclear option. That's what he said on the floor. He said, I agree that the proper way to change Senate rules is through the procedure established in those rules. And he added, he said, I will oppose any effort in this Congress or the next Congress to change the Senate rules other than through the regular order. He said this Congress or the next Congress. So that includes the Congress that we're in right now today. Well, it didn't stop some of the members of his caucus from trying to force the nuclear option again earlier this year. I was one of a bipartisan group of senators. 8 of us worked together, negotiated, I thought, reasonable and responsible changes to Senate procedures. Our goal was to avoid the rush to take drastic steps that would damage this body and our country forever. It was a fair agreement. It was also an agreement that we were told would rule out the use of the nuclear option. So Republicans agreed to support 2 new standing orders and 2 new standing rules of the Senate. Those changes got overwhelmingly supported by Republicans as well as Democrats in this body. In return, the Majority Leader again gave his word that he would not try to break the rules in order to change the rules. Here's what he said just a few months ago right here on the Senate floor. He said any other resolutions related to Senate procedure would be subject to a regular order process. He even added that this included considerations by the Rules Committee. There was no equivocating in the statement by the Democratic leader. There were no ifs, there were no ands, there were no buts. This was January 24th of this year. So here we are again, less than 5 months later, and we're having the same argument all over again. Some Senate Democrats want to use the nuclear option to break the rules, to change the rules, and do away with the right to extended debate on nominations. This would be an unprecedented power grab by the majority. It would gut the advice and consent function of the Senate. It would trample the rights of the minority. It would deprive millions of Americans of their right to have their voices heard through their representatives here in Washington. The nuclear option would irreparably change this institution. Now, Republicans have raised principled objections to a select few of the President's nominees. In other cases, such as the D.C. Circuit Court, we simply want to apply the standard that the Democrats had set, that the court's workload doesn't justify the addition of 3 more judges. President claims his nominees have been treated unfairly. Well, even the Washington Post fact-checker said what the President's comments were untrue. The other day, the Post fact-checker gave the President not just one but two Pinocchios for his claims about Republican delays on his judicial nominees. The White House and the Majority Leader don't want to hear it. They want the Senate to rubber stamp the President's nominees. The Democrats aren't happy with the rulings by the D.C. Circuit Court, and they want to avoid any more inconvenient questions about the Obama administration. Democrats claim they want to change the rules just to make things move more quickly. But that's no excuse. Remember when Majority Leader threatened the same drastic step a couple of years ago? Well, one of the Democrats who stood up to oppose the current Majority Leader, oppose him at the time, was former Senator Chris Dodd. In his farewell speech in this body in late 2010, this is what Senator Dodd had to say. He said, quote, he said, "I can understand the temptation to change the rules that make the Senate so unique." He said, and simultaneously so frustrating. He also said that, but whether such a temptation is motivated by a noble desire to speed up the legislative process or by pure political expedience, he said, I believe such changes would be unwise. Now, that was a Democrat senator with 30 years of service in the Senate. The reality is that the pace of the Senate can be deliberate. Extended debate and questioning of nominees is a vital tool to help ensure that the men and women who run our government are up to the job and are held accountable. Under the system some in the majority want to impose, there will be less opportunity for political minorities to question nominees. There will be less government transparency. The faith of the American people in their government will get smaller and smaller. Mr. President, I believe it would be a terrible mistake for Democrats to pursue the nuclear option and an irresponsible abuse of power. From the beginning, the American political system has functioned on majority rule, but with strong minority rights. Democracy is not winner-take-all. Senator Reid gave his word. We negotiated in good faith earlier this year. We reached a bipartisan agreement to avoid the nuclear option. Using the nuclear option on nominations now would unfairly disregard that agreement. If Democrats break the rules to change the rules, political minorities and all Americans will lose. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
Well, I just had a chance to listen to my colleague from Wyoming, and he states it very well. And I have come to the floor for roughly the same reason. But I don't know how many times you have to say it, because basically I think what the Senator Wyoming was saying and what I want to say is, you know, it's very difficult to reach agreements in the United States Senate. But when you reach an agreement, particularly if it only involves two senators, but particularly if they're leaders of the Senate, a person's word is their bond. And that bond ought to be kept. And as far as I know, always kept. At least that's been my relationship with fellow senators. You say you're going to do something, and you continue that until it's successful. So here we are. No senator has not kept their word yet, but we hear this threat. So I come to the floor to give my comments on it. At the beginning of this Congress, the majority and minority leaders reached an agreement to how to proceed with rules changes. An agreement was reached. We agreed to two rule changes, one change to the standing rules and one to the standing order. Senate Republicans gave up certain rights and protections in those rules changes. That was the first part of the agreement. In exchange for these rules changes, the majority leader gave his word to Republican senators that he would not utilize what's called around here and around this town the nuclear option and not use it during this Congress. Let me review the exact wordings of that agreement as it's recorded for history in the congressional record. This year, on January 24th, 2013, the following exchange took place in the Senate. Senator McConnell stated, quote, "Finally, I would confirm with the Majority Leader that the Senate would not consider other resolutions relating to any standing order or rules this Congress unless they went through the regular order process," question mark, end of quote. The Majority Leader replied, quote, "This is correct. Any other resolution related to Senate procedure would be subject to a regular order process, including consideration by the Rules Committee," end quote. In fact, the Majority Leader gave his word at the beginning of the last Congress as well. He stated, quote, "The Minority Leader and I have discussed this issue on numerous occasions. I know that there is a strong interest in rule changes among many in my caucus. In fact, I would support many of these changes through regular order. But I agree that the proper way to change Senate rules is through the procedures established in those rules, and the Majority Leader said, and I continue to quote, "And I will oppose any effort in this Congress or the next to change the Senate rules other than through regular order." Let me just say that when a United States Senator reaches an agreement and gives his word that he will stick to that agreement, that should mean something around here. And as far as I'm concerned, it means something all the time. And I don't think I've been subject to any agreement with a colleague that hasn't been kept. And let me emphasize something further. There was no contingency on that agreement. Republicans agreed to a change in the rules, and the Majority Leader gave his word that he would not invoke the so-called nuclear option. That was the extent of the agreement, period. I trust the Majority Leader will keep his word and his commitment. If he pulls back on that commitment, it will irreparably damage the Senate. Moreover, the notion that there is now a crisis that demands another rules change is completely manufactured. The Minority Leader has spoken about the culture of intimidation. I'm troubled that it is finding its way into the Senate. For the record, in regard to why there's some talk around this institution of changing the rules, something to do with nominations, in particular judicial nominations, not moving fast enough. I'm in the middle of that as ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. So far this year, we have confirmed 22 lower court nominees, with 2 more scheduled for this week. That is more than double the number of judges that were confirmed at this point during the previous president's second term, and that was President Bush. With the nominations this week, we have confirmed 195 of President Obama's nominees as lower court judges. We have defeated only 2. That's a batting average of 99+%. And I don't know how much better you can get unless they expect the Senate not to raise any questions about anybody appointed by any president to the judgeships of our country. The claim, then, that we're obstructing nominees is plainly without foundation. I have cooperated with the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in moving forward on consensus nominees, and on the Senate floor, there's been a consistent and steady progress on judicial nominations. Yet it seems as if the majority is intent on creating a false crisis in order to effect changes in long-standing Senate practices. They're not even threatening to break. They are now even threatening, can you believe it, to break the rules, to change the rules. Again, I hope the Majority Leader keeps his word. We certainly have upheld our end of the bargain. Could I inquire of the President how many minutes are left for the minority of morning business?
Republicans control 15 minutes.
And how much time? 15 minutes more?
The senator's correct.
Okay. In regard to this whole issue about the Senate as an institution, and where I said if this nuclear option holds, it's going to destroy the Senate.